right, folks, welcome back to our MEA 425 Media Copyright and Licensing class, coming to you from parts unknown in southeastern United States. Today we are going to begin our look specifically at licensing. Now that we've dealt with the copyright part of it, that will continue to kind of, that language will be continue to be present simply because it's a requirement, for music publishing and licensing to exist. A system of ownership and protection has to be in place, and so that's why we dealt with that first. So as that language continues in our discussions, you'll be able to recognize it and understand it. So we've kind of introduced that, and to really get into licensing as the second half of the class, it's really important to understand the music publisher, because that's their main job, or part of their main job, as we'll see here shortly, is to find out how to make money off of music, and usually that has to do with modes of publication, so making it public, available to the public. So in any case, without further ado, let's move on to our overview. And so we're going to start with that very question, what is publishing? Take a historical view of it. I'm less interested with the future of it right now, because of the last 20 years have basically required the practice to update itself substantially, because against everybody's best bet, this whole internet thing isn't a fad that's just going to go away. And so we're on the backside of the digital revolution. The latency of the legal system has caught up with the implications, and so we are kind of in the future, based on how slowly this whole system moves. And then we'll look, in particular at how publishers position themselves relative to money, and so where they get their money from, and how they then turn around and distribute money, what they collect, who their partners are. And then that'll get to the bigger picture of how music publishers actually operate. So how are they set up to function as a business? We'll look at owning music as a primary requirement for for them to exist, right? The idea of copyright primarily, but if you take it down to ownership, we'll look. It's a very concise point that's important to make there, and then understanding the difference between rights versus licenses, and there's language that's associated with both of those. And then, in particular, the types of licenses. So those will be the main tools of the music publisher. So that's our overview for what we're going to look at today. But I'm going to have a sip of Fat Baby coffee. Get you a cup today. Oh, man. That baby is fat. Okay, so what is publishing? So the Cone textbook, which you guys have access to in parts, bits and parts, as I'm enabled by the Teach Act, all right, to duplicate a small portion of a textbook that you're not forced to buy. I found the best definition of what publishing is. So it comes in three main parts. So the first is promoting and licensing the performance and publication. Okay, so there's already a lot going on. They are promoting performance and publication of musical works and compositions, and they are licensing the performance and publication of musical works and compositions. So they're sort of like cheerleaders, right? They want, because the songwriters are transferring that ownership, the actual copyright, to the publishers, they're incentivized to, to market and push these properties. The second part is the administration of the legal protection of the compositions and the collection of income arising from such promotion and licensing. So the administration aspect here is really important because of the amount of, the paperwork that's involved just with, music publishers will file the federal registration, for example, or get your the songwriters set up with their own performing right organization, like BMI, ASCAP, etc. And so they're in this administrative role of, making sure they track the money that's coming in. They're drafting licenses, so legal expertise to draft licenses, file the paperwork for copyright, etc. But then also on the accounting side to follow the income on that side, but also to issue and do the math to figure out how much the royalty checks are for, especially when you've got multiple owners and the rights are subdivided by percentage, as we saw in the last presentation. This is really where the music publishers are sort of highly, they're very specialized already, but the administration part is absolutely crucial. It's, I would say, the fundamental level of what's needed in order for them to remain viable business entities. And then finally, the last thing is they will, of course, pay out their royalties. So they pay the songwriters their share of the collected income. And so that's the full sort of picture. And you can see licensing is in there, right? It's one of the main, it's in the first, 3 words of what this definition includes. And it also is one of the only words that shows up 2 times. And so licensing is completely essential to the publisher, but you got to understand the publisher as the one who does licenses, among other things, I think, to have the complete view. So, when you look at publishing or publishers from a historical point of view, it's really after the Copyright Act of 1831. You'll remember from studying for the test that was when compositions, so, write a song that's been written down as a composition, became protected. And so federally protected, that is, so part of Circle C, the Circle C family. Now you've got a legal basis for the existence of a publishing industry, of a music publishing industry, but at that time it was really just print publishing. Performances weren't copyrightable until a couple decades after this Copyright Act of 1831. And that's about the time that you see one of the first American popular songwriters enjoying commercial success. So, Oh Susanna, She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain, those famous mid-19th century songs are, those are creations of Stephen Foster. And so there's interesting story behind Stephen Foster for those of you who have a historical sort of interest in the topic. That is a good topic to, you can present that for your final presentation, for example. And then in the 1880s to the 1940s, you have the music publishing industry sort of coming into a culmination, or its first sort of, focal point in terms of a place and time. And that is with Tin Pan Alley, which really just refers to a couple blocks near Broadway and West 28th in Manhattan, where songwriters came together to basically, create songs for Broadway and to pitch them to department stores, to print publishers. And so Tin Pan Alley, that model of music publishing had a lot to do with, the scouting of talent. So they would go out and discover songwriters, and then they'd pair them up together, a melodist or a melodic writer, along with a lyricist. They'd create those teams and then see what came out of it, and then go out to, the vaudeville clubs or the department stores where the print music paper section was located. And they would, try to place those songs out there. And so that pitching of songs has always been, since the very inception of music publishing, part of the deal, and that is referred to as song plugging or simply plugging. Time for another sip of Fat Baby. Oh, man. Now, so the music publisher and the rise of the music publisher in the mid-19th century, so the 1850s through the 1940s, especially with their association with Broadway and the theater district there in New York City, gives rise to what's referred to as the American Songbook. There's no, list of songs, but there are American classics. Certainly, the ones I mentioned from Stephen Foster. Then 1890, I think 1899, you've got After the Ball, which is the first 1 million, copies sold on sheet music. And then it was released in the 1920s, re-released on records, which were 78 RPM, and had sort of revival of success there. And so you see this growth of the industry coinciding with national identity there. And so some of the great composers of that time, Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Victor Herbert, are all pillars of, quote, the American songwriting popular song tradition. And so this is all part of the coincides with the rise of music publishing. If you look at it today, it's a lot more, I guess, decentralized, you could say, or not, depending. Like, you've got, I would say, a lot more people like Charles Harris, who wrote After the Ball, the first million seller. He decided to go the self-publisher route, which was very sort of advanced for him at the time. You can see by the chart on this page that most, 65% or so, at least half, of music publishing income is collected by only 3 companies. So that's Sony, ATV, and you've got the Beatles catalog included in ATV. You also have UMG, Universal Music Group. Their publishing branch under that giant conglomerate is called Universal Music Publishing. They're coming in right behind Sony, ATV, and then Warner at 12.5. So between those 3 companies alone, those are your major global sort of conglomerates, right? They're not just publishers, but they belong to entertainment conglomerates. Sony, Universal, Warner are all, major global conglomerate entertainment companies, you could say. Independent publishing companies would be next, and they're the last one, or the next 2 on that chart, and you can see they're coming in, representing together almost 10% of music publishing income. And then finally, you've got your self-publishing songwriters, and so this is part of like the DIY, recipe for people who want to do everything that they need to have a career in the music business. And Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan have always been, or traditionally been, part of the main sort of the first line of who's who in self-publishing songwriters. But interestingly enough, Dylan just sold out about a month ago. Earlier this year, sold his songwriting catalog. So that's another interesting story, that someone who wanted to do a project, look at that for their final project about self-publishing songwriters, as a DIY thing, and then get the Dylan story in there. Absolutely legitimate area of research. So now let's look at where music publishers draw their income from. So you've got it's licensing. Obviously, they're not selling catalogs, but they're granting access to catalogs. So they're giving permission for people, different users, to get access and permission to use compositions. They're not dealing with giving access for people to use sound recordings, which, that's Circle P, and that's the labels or the producers that will be dealing with access, and, exploiting Circle P is different from the compositions, right? And so the primary sources of income for music publishers, you can see by far and away, it's the right of public performance. And so radio income, venues, television, theaters are also considered public performance, but, movie theaters, but they don't go through ASCAP and BMI. They're sort of handled, separately, but as you can see, public performance is where the money is for publishers, and therefore for copyright holders, right? Because that's the name of the game. We're trying to exploit our ownership. Then you've got mechanicals. So anytime that you are perceiving music because a machine is playing it, that does not count for a radio, but If you can play, it does count for a computer. If you can, press a button and play what you choose to play, as opposed to the radio kind of has its own playlist and you just listen to it passively. But if you're the active sort of chooser of what to play, like a CD, in the olden days, or if you're going to go way back, like a cassette or a record, even Spotify, those are songs that are coming to your ears by virtue of a machine of some kind. And so the presence of the machine is where you get the mechanical from. That's in terms of the name. But typically these are, record companies that are making, this is the mechanical is the license that lets the record company turn Circle C into Circle P, right? So it's the permission to use the song to make a copy of the song you need the machine to play. And so that's a mechanical license. If you go into the studio and you want to cover a song, you need a mechanical license to do that. Synchronization would be the third primary form of income. So anytime you've got a song being used in a film, for example, that's a good example of a synchronization license. Anytime you have music being paired with film, that's the synchronization. They're brought together. And so those are your primary sources of income, and together they represent, that's 95% of the income. And then you've got this secondary source list of sources, and they all add up to about 5%, which is pretty astounding. You think of the Super Bowl commercials, commercial advertising. That's a ton of money going down for a 30-second ad. I think it was $5 million. There's a big portion of that is going to the music side. And so to think of all of the Super Bowl ads in one, game or 1 year, that's a big bunch of money. And that's, all adding up to that's a big bunch of money for the music that's in those ads. And that's all adding up to just a mere tiny little fraction of what commercial advertising is worth for the entire year. All the music and all of the advertisements that you see pales in comparison. It's a teeny fraction of the money brought in by public performance, mechanicals, and synchronization. Printed music, background music, like if you're in an elevator, they call it elevator music, but if you go to the dentist, they've got music piped in, that's called business music. Or if you're sitting on a plane and there's, a playlist available through the headsets, that's another sort of background service. Video games, consumer products, you open the greeting card and there's a song that plays, or you get the little bear for Valentine's that says, "Squeeze my paw," and there's music there, right? That's a consumer product. So those are all your secondary sources. So that's kind of the big picture of where, who's paying, right? The music publisher. And so they draft the license and give those folks access to certain songs. And then those users, put that out to the public, generate the income from that. And now you've got the royalty stream coming back. You'll remember the music pipeline. So you've got the rights going across from the publisher through the users and the licenses. And now they've paid, and here's the money coming back as royalty. And so, as it says here, you've got the income is paid by the user to the publisher. And so the filmmaker is a user, the commercial advertiser is a user, the record company, they're all paying, right, for the license. And the publisher is going to take half of that tip, and this is the standard agreement, but it can be modified based on whatever is written in the songwriter contract. But the publisher is going to take half of that, and that's referred to as the publisher's share. So when you see that language, the publisher's share versus the writer's share, a lot of times that can be confusing to people learning about the music business. But this is all it represents, is publisher's going to take half of what they earn through licensing and then give the other half to the writer or writers, right? So it's 50-50 split. And if there are 3 writers, then they will take that 50% from the publisher and then split that 3 ways, right? 33 1/3% of that half that is the quote writer's share. But there are some exceptions there. Almost everything passes through the publisher, but performing rights, organization, distribution, they pay the publisher directly and the songwriter directly, and so that doesn't pass through the publisher. There are other exceptions, like songwriters like Springsteen and Dylan, among others, who are self-publishing. They're acting as their own publishing company, and that's going to take some specialized knowledge to draft those licenses. I'm sure it doesn't hurt to have a few gold records hanging on the wall, and then you can pay lawyers to act in that fashion for you. But whatever it is, if you are a self-publishing songwriter, then you can collect both the publisher share and the writer share, and then that's the DIY idea, right? To cut out sort of the middleman there. Another exception would be if you've got multiple songwriters and they're collaborating, then that's when you've got the writer share has to be split, and so that's what the distribution of income sort of looks like for music publishers. So when you look at their operations and you want to get set up as a music publisher, or what does a music publisher's sort of business model look like, you've got two primary departments here. You've got the creative side, and then you've got the administrative side. And this is very similar for a lot of different music business entities. And so the creative side may also be known as the professional department, as you can see here. But they will, of course, need to acquire songwriting talent. If it was easy as pushing a button for a hit song, then believe me, they would do it, right? It would make things a lot easier for them, but you still need talented people today. And they have to be signed. And so the administrative side will draft those songwriter deals once the creative department finds the songwriters, and they'll secure them to the company for, usually the life of the copyright of the songs that they draft during that time period. But it once again all depends on the how the agreement is written. And so their job on the creative side is to basically acquire the talent, or they may acquire stuff that's already written. They can draft a publishing deal for a song instead of a songwriter, or a catalog. They can buy an entire catalog of songs if there's a songwriter nobody knew about that turns out to be really talented, and then they can be like, wow, we can make money off of this, so just sell us. We want, transfer the copyrights of all of these songs. And they can buy a catalog, outright, and this all, happens. I mean, that's how the Beatles lost control over all of their songs. There's a great book called Northern Songs that's all about, why they went public with their copyrights, and how they ended up with a less than 50% ownership of their copyrights. And so other functions of the creative department, they want to develop their talent, and then finally end up with, so maybe critiquing the songs, pairing them with other songwriters, taking them through drafts, recording, draft demos, and then finally getting to a demo that's strong enough to pitch and to plug, right? On the administrative side, filing the copyright application, if they choose to do so, drafting the licenses, and then, we've got the accounting folks that are tracking the income, paying out the royalties, dealing with the international business. And so that's kind of the overview of what the music publisher sort of operations picture looks like. As far as music ownership, I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, but it's a pretty concise, thing that the U.S. law allows for, and that's right at the top here. Upon satisfying the three requirements, so once you've got original expression and it's fixed, then ownership exists in the author, right? Now, the thing about work for hire language is if you're considered to be an employee and you sign a document that you're going to create songs as an employee, then you're no longer actually the author. The company is the author. So that's the only thing why work for hire is a separate sort of category. We don't have to worry about that right now. Just recognize that that is a sort of alternative route there that strips ownership. So it's really important. So, be attentive to the language here. After the 1978 law, copyright no longer had to be secured, but it just was said to subsist, meaning that it just kind of magically appears once you've got those three, it's original, it's expressed, and it's fixed in a retrievable form. All of a sudden, boom, there it is. It subsists in the owner. It's part of the intellectual property that can be passed on to family, etc., or transferred as other property might be. And so pre-78, or I guess, in the world we currently live in, post-78, the author doesn't have to do anything else to, quote, secure the protection. Pre-78, they actually had to list the notice, copyright 1978, Paul Linden, Funky Dumpling Music, or whatever the publishing company might be. Then that notice had to be written correctly in order for copyright to be, quote, secured. And there are instances where it was not written correctly, and those works went into the public domain. So it's kind of a ridiculous situation to have a typo that makes you lose your property, but that was the way the law used to be. So that was changed out. It just kind of subsists now, meaning that it comes about once you satisfy those three things, and that's all that's necessary. So it's kind of three things and you're good. Notice that this does apply to, the song as a composition, so the words and melody, or Circle C, and that's what the publisher's interested in. But it also applies to Circle P. After the record company gets the mechanical license, gets the song, access to the song, and gets an artist to perform it and make that record, now you've got Circle P. And, if it's you've got the license and it's expressed and fixed in the recording itself, now you've got what's necessary to be, you're an owner of Circle P. The labels are, right? They're the author of that recording. If there's no label involved and you've got, you're recording out of your basement or home studio, then you're sort of the independent producer that becomes the owner of that recording by law. Unless you've signed an agreement otherwise. Oftentimes, if an artist comes in and they're paying a producer for the right to, use the studio, then that payment means that the masters will, the ownership of the masters goes to the artist that's paying for it. And so that should be recognized. But without that payment, the ownership can be, it would default legally to the creator of the recording, and so that would be your producer / engineer. Now, in terms of collaborations, as we mentioned, ownership will split evenly based on how many collaborators there are. So the writer's share will be 50-50 if there are 2, 25, 25, 25, 25 if there are 4, on down the line. So it's basic math. Okay, just a couple more slides here. So when you look at the difference between rights and licenses, so rights come along with ownership. So there's the bundle of rights. So it's a claim to ownership. But a license, on the other hand, is what the owner gives, or what the owner basically sells is permission. Or you can say that they're renting the property for a specific amount of time to a specific person for a specific kind of use, right? So it's a rental agreement for intellectual property is what a good way to look at, what a license really is. So a license is a permission to use, access, or otherwise exploit all or part of the property. You'll remember that you can license just by specific rights or a percentage of the rights. All of that is, can be carved up because of what we call severability of copyright. And so, permission is granted. So being attentive to the language, permission is granted, but the ownership or the copyright itself would be transferred or assigned. And so that's an important thing, because you'll see both of these terms used. And when you see a grant, that usually means that we're talking about licensing. But when you see the word transfer and assigned, that should let you know that now we're talking about the actual copyright itself. The ownership of the copyright is moving along there. Another thing to keep in mind, types of licenses, exclusive versus non-exclusive licenses. So, anything that's exclusive means that some people are being, excluded, right? So an exclusive license means that only the licensee, so whoever's paying for it, is allowed to use this in this way. So an exclusive synchronization license for film would mean that only this film production company can use this song, in this way for the time period that's specified, and that no other film is entitled to use the song, or if it's a deal with the record company, they can't use the recording. And so when you have an exclusive license, you're going to have the transfer of the copyright that comes along with that, because if no one else can use it, then the licensee needs to actually ensure that, and so they'll be the copyright will be transferred to them for the duration of the license. So a broad rights license for a film company, they may have it for the period of 1 year, or for the life of the copyright. Non-exclusive licenses, now you've got multiple users can use the same property. They're a lot less expensive. So when you're saying only one person can use this, then it's obviously going to drive the price way up. And non-exclusive licenses, since you've got a lot of people using it or renting it, then you're not going to transfer the copyright to them because they're not exclusive, right? They don't have the right to say only I can use this. And so exclusivity is really important. And then there's a catalog of licenses. So we've talked about, in the music pipeline I showed you, there were just like these top 3 or 4 licenses here. And so what I've done is, this is the whole sort of catalog here. Actually, this slide, not the graphic here, but, performance, mechanical synchronization. That's where, the vast majority of your publishing income, in the 90 percentile range, is going to be in those 3 types of licenses. But you also have print. Videogram is what's required when it's a combination of synchronization and mechanical. So like a DVD, for example, that's considered a videogram. And so that requires a specific kind of license that's beyond a synchronization license. It's just for the film and the movie theaters. Now we've got the sort of, you can buy the DVD or rent the DVD. How does that money get carved up? So the videogram license will describe that. Musical products, so like we talked about the consumer products that have music associated with them, like the cards or the little gifts, the bears that play music. Any toy that has music programmed into it would be a good example of that. Digital transmission, so a streaming license is there. Electrical transcription, so you listen to a radio show that has a theme song to it that plays every time. The electrical transcription is the license that recognizes how much that kind of use and how much the owners will be paid. Dramatic use, so if you see theatrical, that's actually a movie theater. So dramatic and grand rights, that refers to, quote, the living stage. So actors and actresses on Broadway or doing Shakespeare or something like that. That's a specific rights package for them. Commercial advertising, as we talked about, television advertising, radio advertising, even advertising in print that has lyrics associated with it. They have, that's a license for them. Video games or other types of new media, that's a license type for that kind of use. And finally, what I refer to as a rights deal, so technically a dramatic adaptation is when you take a book, turn it into a movie, or a book, turn it into a play, or whatever it may be. And so that's the kind of full catalog of license types. And I want to introduce that now that we're moving into licensing, because we're going to look at almost all of those in a fair amount of detail over the next, say, look at the syllabus. They're really about 2 or 3 weeks at the end of the semester, where we'll conclude and you guys will present your final projects. But from now until then, this is the world that we're going to be in, right? So we're going to be looking at the specific standards and prices, and what a performance license looks like, or digital transmission for streaming and all of that. So this is a forecast of where we're going. Now there's some specific things that you want to keep in mind now that we're to this stage. And so, I like to have a vocab section at the end of these presentations to remind you of the way that language is being used here is very sort of specific to our industry. And so once again, when you see transfer, sell, and assign, we're not talking about licensing here. Oops, that is a typo. Look at that. Boom. Okay. That means that we're talking about the ownership claim. And so it's not licensing, but it's actually, we're talking about ownership of the property. And the ownership claim in all of the copyright is called an undivided interest, or in part of the property is when you've got a percentage or one or more of the bundled rights that are embedded in the property. So this is the language of an exclusive license, for example, or when you're selling or doing a copyright transfer. So keep in mind that transfer, sell, and assign all belong to a specific type of situation that should not be confused with grant or a permission, right? That's the language of licensing as opposed to ownership. Okay, so very important distinction that's oftentimes confused. So you grant access through licenses, but you transfer ownership through assigning a copyright, for example. Subsisting copyright can subsist or it can be secured. So we saw a 1978 law had the impact of securing copyright is no longer a concern through like writing the notice properly, but now it's said to subsist. So it magically appears when you check those 3 boxes and boom, you're a copyright holder. So the word subsist refers to the modern era of copyright ownership. Exclusive versus non-exclusive, we just looked at that as 2 kind of modes of copyright licensing, right? Exclusive means no one else can use it, and the copyright itself oftentimes is transferred or assigned with that kind of a license. A non-exclusive license is much less expensive, and the publisher will maintain possession of the copyright itself. Circle C versus Circle P, we know we've got what's referred to as the underlying composition is Circle C, and then Circle P is the audio recording. And the composition is administered by the songwriter and the publisher as an ownership group, and the audio recording is administered by the label typically, or independent producer as the owner there. Not to be confused with other letters with circles around them, right? Like the circle R for a registered copyright is different from, not from a registered trademark, as opposed to the letters TM, which means that it's common law or just good for a state, as opposed to all of the United States. That's why we've got the little letters. And so, trademark is to protect logos that associated with merchandise, like the swoosh for Nike, as opposed to Circle C and Circle P. Those are copyright, so don't get those confused. The writer's share versus the publisher's share, we talked about that earlier. Once again, that is the distribution of income as royalties or as payment to the publisher. That's the publisher's share from the user. And then the publisher is going to turn around and distribute half of that, typically, to the writer, and that's the writer's share. And some writers are self-publishers, meaning they set up their own publishing company, and they get both halves of that, the writer's share and the publisher's share. And then publishing administration, or if you just are an administrative publisher, that's when you're not doing the creative aspects, but you're really just drafting the licenses, collecting the money, doing the accounting, sending in a financial statement to the publisher, to the songwriters, and looking at making sure they get their royalty distributions. So that's the kind of paperwork side of music publishing. And then you've got a self-publishing songwriter. Once again, we just talked about that. That's a songwriter who gets the writer's share, but they're also acting as their own publisher. And it's, the best way to position yourself to make the most money. However, you also have to know how to draft a license and how to account to any collaborators you may have, and it's not just an evident kind of thing of I'm going to set up this thing and then collect a bunch of money. You really have to know how to exploit the properties. And then finally, song plugging, right? Song plugging is the old-time term for when you've got the promotional aspect of a publisher who's out there pushing the property, trying to pitch it to singers, record companies, print music publishers. So if you're plugging it, that means you're basically pitching it or promoting it. All right, I know that's a lot of information here, but we're at a transition point in the class, so I want to make sure you guys can see the big picture. And then once again, we're going to dive into the individual areas from here on out of the different license types. Let me know if you've got any questions. Please do leave your comments below, especially anything you didn't understand, stuff you liked, stuff that you thought should be, maybe tightened up on or whatever. I'm open to all critiques and comments. Thank you. Have a good day.